And so science and policy are both interdependent and bidirectional. And sort of the two fundamental concepts to remember here are science for policy and policy for science. Science for policy refers to scientific findings that are used as the basis for developing public policy, whereas policy for science is government laws as well as regulations and policies that affect the practice of science. Most of what I do, I would say, classifies as science for policy, although policy for science is sort of my other interest outside. So you may actually end up doing both of these things in your career. So where can you do science policy? I thought it would be helpful to just bring up a few examples of areas. And so just looked up the different areas that are in the 116th Congress currently from congress.gov. And the numbers that you can see here are bills and resolutions that are currently under that term. The highest, just to highlight a few, health is among the highest, as well as science, technology, and communications, international affairs, foreign trade, and international finance. So there's a lot of discussions about how to maintain the US as #1, but also how we collaborate with other countries, as well as national security and armed forces and education, among others. So this is a good source to sort of get a sense of what's going on federally and what issues are being discussed. So now you sort of have the basics. So I'll shift a little bit to how do we actually make policy. So you all know that there are 3 branches of government, and I won't go into detail about this, but the legislative branch is where laws are made, passed on to the executive branch, which carries out the laws, and then the judicial branch, which evaluates the laws, and these are sort of work together. So how do you actually make policy at this level? So this is a very high level, just to give you an idea of the kind of impact that you can have. And this is, again, at the level of bills turning into law. So the idea here is that just any idea that you have could become a bill. The bill is introduced, goes to a committee, and then the floor where it's debated and voted on. And that results in presidential action, which can be approved or passed. There are obviously different outcomes of this. But this is just kind of an overview of how this works. But also, I just want you to kind of come away with the fact that your idea can actually have a big impact if it becomes a bill and goes through this process. So again, keep in mind this high-level impact. So how do you actually craft effective policies? So as any project, you want to do your research on the topic and figure out what the need is for the policy. So what does the landscape look like? Does something like this already exist? What need is this filling? You want to be able to define the main concepts and key points to non-scientific audiences, as well as really crafting what the purpose and the goal is going to be very specifically, what the scope is, how broad are you thinking, what level are you thinking of, which stakeholders will be affected, as well as creating a standard that can be followed. And this goes not just in government, but also within organizations that have policies that are helpful to maintain over time. And I think the take home here is that you want to, once you have an idea what the policy is, you want to establish a clear course of action of how you will implement it. And think about both short-term and long-term impacts. And this is obviously a quick slide that has a lot of detail, but I think it's a good sort of roadmap to think about how you actually would craft a policy and what that implications would be. So when you are in this process, you might want to ask yourself a few questions. Again, looking at the sort of existing landscape and what policies already exist, what bills already exist in this, what need your policy will fill, and what do you want to accomplish with it, what the outcomes might be. This is sort of the basic first step of this. Then you want to think about both advantages and disadvantages, so having counter arguments to people who might disagree and how you might address that. And then there's also kind of the practical aspect of this, of how will the policy be monitored, how will it be enforced, who will manage it, how much time and effort it will take. So this is sort of, again, the practical aspect. And then again, the long-term question of what impact is it going to have long-term, which stakeholders will be affected, will it be sort of disadvantage for certain groups, or what does that look like? And again, what groups are you thinking of? So I think these are helpful just as you're thinking about crafting a policy on your topic of interest. So now I want to shift a little bit to give you a little bit of advice and just ideas of where you might be doing science policy as you progress or you're starting in this field. So this is just a list of different settings where you might be doing science policy. The range kind of goes from think tanks and universities where it's more sort of a research-based role, all the way to Capitol Hill, where you would essentially be a lobbyist and be sort of on the Hill, and your job would be like that. So I think there's a continuum sort of along this. So roughly, think tanks and universities would be kind of at the front end. Professional societies and nonprofits obviously lobby for their cause. Biotech companies as well. Funding agencies are sort of overlaying a lot of these different sectors. And then federal and state governments at a higher level, as well as Capitol Hill, where, as I said, you would essentially be more doing more lobbying. So if you want to work in one of these settings, I would say that the skills that you need, you already have a lot of them. So as a scientist, you have subject matter expertise as well as understanding the scientific process, which is very helpful, and a lot of it can be applied to policies. You can also analyze data as well as have really good critical thinking skills and are able to engage in project management. And a lot of this, quite frankly, in my job is a lot of project management. So you're translating a lot of the skills that you already have into policy. And the skills that you might want to develop are really thinking about how you want to communicate your science to non-scientists, as well as the audience that you're talking to. One of the things that is exciting and challenging about policy is consensus building. And this is something that is necessary if you want to get a policy passed through the process and approved through different groups. That's something that we pretty much do on a daily basis, as well as, that networking and building professional relationships are really helpful for policy, and that's how a lot of the field works. So now, how do you actually gain the knowledge that you need to advance in science policy? I just want to give you a few pointers here. So I think it just starts with being aware of what's going on around you and knowing what the landscape looks like and what policies already exist in your field, what's been done, and who the players are. You want to really use that to engage in policy discussions, and I highly encourage using social media. A lot of my exposure has come from Twitter when I was starting out in the field, as well as writing op-eds and blog posts. So really anything that is non-academic is really going to challenge you to write in a different way. So that's very helpful as well. I would also encourage you to do a lot of informational interviews. So my position is only one type of role. Government relations is one way to do this. But the more people you talk to, the more you learn about how things work and what different options are. Locally, I would say engaging with science policy groups. Science policy fellowships obviously are a good way to transition, as well as engaging a little bit in talking to representatives. Again, local engagement versus national engagement is helpful, and I would advise doing both to an extent. So I want to just now give you some basics about what these job titles might look like that you're looking for. Again, as I said, the sort of spectrum going more from the research side to more the lobbying side. And so basically where my position fits in is more kind of research and reporting on policy, which is a lot of different types of analysts. The second is sort of communicating and promoting science, which is more on the advocacy side. Government relations does fit in here to an extent in terms of promoting and advocating for the research in the university, as well as some lobbying at this point. You might also engage in programs as well as public service. Again, different levels here, going up all the way up to policy advisor, and then being on the Hill, the options of actually working on congressional committees, which is another level. So hopefully that's useful. I think one of the things I wanted to just stress the idea of writing policy, because this is something that I do probably 85% of my day. And it's not something I was trained in, and I am still learning, but this is a critical thing to learn, for you to learn and as you progress. So I just want to touch up a little bit on what JSPG is, since it is a medium where you can bolster your research and writing credentials in policy. And as Megan said, it is an open access and peer-reviewed publication, as well as a nonprofit. Our main goal is to really help bolster these skills for early career researchers, as well as encourage them to engage in the policymaking process at all levels of government. So not just what I showed you kind of at the high level, but also locally and nationally, globally. There are a lot of levels where you can contribute to policy. And we publish a lot of different types of write-ups. So just, you can see here, as well as promote the work following on social media as well. So I encourage you to check out JSPG on Twitter as well. So other ways you might engage in advocacy, just shifting a little bit now to this, besides writing, what other things you might you want to do? I think I would say that, you know, I've heard it said that advocacy takes as much time as you have to give it, basically. It doesn't mean that it has to take a long time. It depends on how much time you have, but any time that you have is helpful. So here are a few suggestions. If you just have a few minutes, you can make a phone call, send a tweet, post on Facebook. 1 hour, maybe writing a letter, an op-ed, or attending a local meeting. If you have a full day, you can engage more with your representatives through maybe a lab tour, visiting a local office, or coming to DC for a Hill day. And then if you really have more time and want to engage in a more substantial way, you can actually start a local policy and advocacy group. So just some things to keep in mind, that advocacy can happen anywhere, and just depends on how much time you want to give. So I want to sort of close with this idea of, I know a lot of people want to engage in policy, may not know where to start. And so I really like this quote from Chris Pickett. He published this article in ASBMB today, and he, you know, talking about his path and when he was starting. I think the only way to know if you like it and what it's like is just to start. So his advice is to just commit to finding out what it is that you're passionate about, and once you're sort of on that path, your confidence will grow, you will engage in more activities, and you're sort of establish yourself in that space. So there's really no secret. You just have to start somewhere and keep doing things in this space. So the last thing I'll say is that, policy is becoming a more popular career. There's a lot of people who are doing a lot of things that I mentioned today. So how do you set yourself apart in this field? I think the main thing here is that you want to find something that you're really passionate about and tell your own story that will really set you apart, in that your passion for the issue will show in the way that you say that, whether it's through a blog post, whether it's on a podcast, or calling your representatives, or finding other ways to gain experience. It's really important to show that you're excited and committed to this path. That'll help you when you apply for jobs and fellowships. But it really comes down to telling your story and your sort of unique way of crafting your space, your policy space, because everybody has a unique story, and that's really important and powerful. So I want to just leave you with some resources. So I mentioned a couple of articles by Chris Pickett. I highly recommend looking up these two. Both of them are at ASBMB today. This article from Yvette Seeger, From Pipettes to Science Policy, is also a very good sort of fundamental read on different policy topics. A lot of scientific societies have policy arms, including SFN and others I've listed here. So if you're a member of a society, I would definitely encourage you to look into that and get involved. And then other ways to build up your skills through either JSPG or the National Science Policy Network. And congress.gov is also a good resource for keeping track of bills and what's going on at the federal level. And that's it. So I'll leave you with my contact information. Happy to chat more if you would like to connect on LinkedIn, as well as I'm also on Twitter. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Adriana. I'm clapping, and I'm sure that everyone else is clapping along too. That was excellent information, and I feel like I learned something new from you every single time we talk, so thank you for that. I have one quick question for you, and then I'm going to pass it over to David really quick. So you kind of segued into this awesome conglomeration of all these really great resources for graduate students. And so my question is, how does a graduate student or even an undergrad kind of get involved at those organizations? If they're the first one at their university or they're kind of new to this field, what's a good place to start getting into that? Like, what's a good first step, maybe?
Yeah, so what I usually advise is kind of building your reputation both locally and nationally at the same time. So that's kind of how I progressed, I guess. If you have a local science policy group, that's really helpful. If not, you can start one. And that's also great because it gives you a lot of leadership experience and makes you stand out. Scientific societies are really helpful. I think that I've sort of done that through my progression. So when I went to scientific society meetings, I would go to sort of my research area. Then I started going more to professional development and policy, and ended up organizing a policy panel and so forth. So I think using the resources that you have and seeing kind of where the policy is in that, but definitely recommend societies are a good way to start.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think we're going to touch more on that once we get into our panelists. But first, I'm going to pass it over to David for a quick synopsis on what our organizations are doing.
So hey, everybody. Dr. Banks, thanks for the great presentation. I wanted to just re-up for, since a few people were still trickling in, that this is the inaugural event for our North Carolina Science Policy Training Series, which is open to any North Carolina student. And we'll be covering a whole bunch of things that Dr. Bankston mentioned as ways that students can get involved and how people in general can get involved in policy, especially transitioning from academia into that space. So we'll be having seminars throughout the academic year about what a career in science policy looks like in different places, and workshops to help people get involved either through better science communication and writing or through preparing to do advocacy yourself. And later on, we'll also have opportunities to personally or in virtual form go and visit with our legislators and advocate on important science issues that matter to you. So if any of that is interesting to you, definitely keep track of us. We're at groups at UNC Greensboro, UNC Chapel Hill, and NC State University. Take a look in the chat for links to the training series, where if you haven't signed up yet, you can sign up and look at and keep track of all the events we have and will do in the future as we schedule them. Also, if you are part of the series, at the end, you will get a certificate if you complete the series that says, you've gone through all this training and you're a science policy expert. But to get that certificate, for every event you attend, you have to attend a certain number and you need to submit a short write-up of that event, like 150 words, nothing too crazy. But you can submit that. The form is in the chat. You can also find the form in the email that we sent out for this event. So I'll stop talking now, throw it back to Megan for our great set of panelists.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I think it's an excellent opportunity because not everybody can do a graduate degree or an undergrad and also get another degree in science policy. So this is an excellent opportunity for students to kind of start engaging in this field. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists. We'll start off with John Hardin. John Hardin is the Executive Director of the North Carolina Board of Science, Technology, and Innovation. He is, hold on, lost my place, from 2003 to 2008. He's also served as the board's Deputy Director and Chief Policy Analyst. Hardin's duties include developing and justifying legislation related to defining statewide research capacity and structure, implementing science, technology, and innovation-related economic development policy and resource allocations, research analysis, and review substantive policy issues and proposals, and more. He currently serves as a board member for the State Science and Technology Institute, the North Carolina Science Festival, the Keenan Fellows Program Board Chair, and Families Moving Forward in Durham. A native of Tulsa, Oklahoma, Hardin holds a MA and PhD degrees in political science from UNC Chapel Hill, a BA in economics from Baylor, and a certificate of completion for the Leadership Decision-Making Program from Harvard University John F. Kennedy School of Government. He and his wife Jane live in Durham and have 2 daughters who are recent college graduates. Congratulations. All right, we'll move on. Yeah, I'm going to introduce all the panelists and then I'll start giving you all some questions. So thanks for being here, John. Next up is Erin Mead. Erin Mead is the Senior Manager for the National Audubon Society. Erin is a policy campaign manager for the National Audubon Society, as I just mentioned. Her role involves partnering on issue campaigns with other organizations to build political power and advance the National Audubon Society's climate and conservation priorities. She has previously served as a senior consultant at Kaiser Permanente, as well as the legislative aide in the U.S. Senate, and received her BA in political science from Marquette University in 2004. Welcome, Erin. Thank you for being here. Next up, we have Dr. Callie Prince. She is a current AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the U.S. Department of Defense. She has previously held positions as a postdoctoral fellow with the National Institute on Aging, as well as the Baltimore Regional Chair of the Science Policy Discussion Group. She received her PhD in Genetic, Genomics, and Development from the University of Texas at San Antonio, and has a BS in Animal Science and Behavioral Neuroscience from Purdue University in 2009. And last but not least, our last panelist, Brittany Webster. She is a program manager, public affairs manager at the American Geophysical Union. She is a Georgia native and received her BA in Comparative Literature and International Affairs from the University of Georgia in 2009 and received her JD from Boston University School of Law in 2012. She began her career in policy as a legislative fellow for a member of the House of Representatives in 2013. Following her time on Capitol Hill, she worked for a lobbying firm and dedicated to working with nonprofits and working on senatorial campaign in 2014. Ms. Webster began working at the American Geophysical Union in 2015 as a senior specialist, dividing her energy between advocating for science on Capitol Hill and helping scientists effectively communicate and engage with their legislators. In 2019, she was promoted to program manager of AGU's Public Affairs Department, and in this role, she oversees AGU's congressional strategy and manages the legislative team. So welcome, panelists. Thank you so much for being here. Let me see if everyone has their cameras on. Excellent. So let's first see, okay, I don't see any questions so far for our panelists in the chat, but I have lots of questions. So first I wanna give everyone kind of a softball question, and that's really, how did you get exposed to science policy and advocacy? And were there organizations or mentors that kind of helped push you along in that process? So I'll start with Brittany since I introduced her last. Brittany, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would say in law school, I went in wanting to do intellectual property, and by the time I came out, I was definitely wanted to be more of an environmental lawyer, but then I had the opportunity to work on the Hill. which was, and my role was more about science, given the subcommittees my boss sat on, than necessarily strictly environmental policy. And so that's really kind of how I transitioned from environmental to more, maybe we'll say hardcore science. And I would say one of my mentors is in the office I worked in. We had a Knaus fellow, or a previous Knaus fellow, and she was really helpful in helping me get my feet wet with the committee. But also I was really fortunate that my boss sat on the House Science Committee. So I had all committee staff kind of available to me. And another resource that was also really great that's available to everyone is the Congressional Research Service. They produce wonderful reports on everything you could ever need to know about issues. And when you're congressional staff, you have the added benefit of being able to attend their trainings as well as ask them specific questions related to your boss. But then I would also say, actually, just meeting with scientists as well. I got to meet with tons of scientists on a wide variety of issues, because when you sit on science committee, everyone wants to meet with you. And I think that also was just great exposure to so many different areas of science.
Yeah, absolutely. I always forget that the Congressional Research Service is available to everyone. So that's an awesome point. Dr. Prince, you're up. How did you get exposed to science policy, and were there special mentors or organizations that helped you get involved?
I would say my second year in graduate school at UT Health in San Antonio is when I became interested in science policy. Frankly, I didn't have the vocabulary to express what I wanted to do. I just kind of had an idea that I wasn't necessarily interested in the academic route. So I talked to my mentor about it, and he said, okay, that's a good idea, I guess. I'm like, all right. And so those seeds were planted the second year in graduate school. And maybe a year or so later, I attended the annual Biomedical Research Conference for minority students in San Antonio. And I stopped by, I think after my poster presentation, I stopped by the AAAS table that was there. And I just talked with some of the representatives at that table. And they're like, whoa, this is so awesome. And so I kept that in mind as I continued through graduate school. And so that's the answer to the first question. And as far as there were mentors if there were mentors that helped me along the way, their help was more of just answering questions if I had them, not necessarily giving me a direction to go into. And so that was the benefit of being curious and confused and excited and young and fresh. They kind of helped propel me in this direction. And as an aside, when I was looking into postdoctoral fellowships, I was very frank with the potential mentors and my interest in science policy, and expressing the importance of ensuring that not only did I contribute to the scientific aspects of the lab, but making sure I developed the sides of my CV that would be important to the field I was transitioning to.
That's a great point. I think that the confusion is totally real. And also that being honest and open with not only yourself, but the people you're going to work for and with in your future. I think that's so important. So we'll pass it over to Erin. Erin, who are your mentors, and how did you get involved in advocacy and policy?
Yeah, I am not a scientist. I feel like that's a disclaimer I have to put in. I should have it like big red letters over my head. I am very, very much not a scientist. So I graduated from college, went and worked in the Senate for about 8 years. And in that time, I worked on agriculture and some nutrition and food systems policy. And from there, kind of got interested and into public health. And that's largely what I worked on at Kaiser Permanente in support of the government relations team, and some of the advocacy work that they did and it's a C3 nonprofit health system, so a little bit different than the big insurance companies. And I came to Audubon because what I increasingly heard and saw, as as I worked and spent a lot of time in my personal time with food systems advocates and farm advocates, was the impact of climate change on our food systems. And literally, like, no matter what you were talking about in public health, it's sort of like, as you went up the causal ladder, you ended up at these like root causes of the problems, and a lot of them were climate-based or climate roots, right? So the earth is now very literally on fire, and I felt like my experience, my knowledge is in how power moves, how policy gets enacted, how you get enough people in a place, physically or digitally, to move decision makers to do things they otherwise wouldn't do, which is obviously the point of advocacy. It is essential to any action on climate change in our current political system, right? So I understood that, and I'm very lucky at Audubon because we have wonderful scientists who tell us the things we need to know, and do some advocacy with us as well. But they allow me to do my job because they can tell me the science of the impact climate change is having on birds, and we can actually use that science to engage our millions of members across the country who care about birds. So we can translate the science into sort of lay person language that is meaningful and helps us recruit grassroots people to take action to save birds from climate and other threats. So that's sort of how I approach it, but not a scientist. I have no degree letters. You guys have so many.
I invited you here for a reason, Erin. You have a lot of skills that I think scientists might not have immediately. So we appreciate your input always. And I think that's an excellent point because we wanted to have a difference in perspective too, to look at how nonprofit organizations and professional societies engage in advocacy with their members and also with the general society. So I'll pass it over to you, John. What got you into science policy?
Well, it was largely by accident, but first I'll tell you how in a minute, but I wanted to say that Dr. Bankston's presentation was really good. I have my own set of slides that are for a similar presentation, a lot of overlap between the two, but there are also some information in hers that I'm gonna now incorporate into mine. So that was good, I learned a lot. So I'm trained as a political scientist, and it's not because I'm a political animal. I actually kind of hate politics. I studied political science, one, because I kind of had a morbid fascination with how do these big important decisions get made that impact people's lives. And second, I actually am more interested in policy than the actual politics side of things. But at the time, there weren't many freestanding public policy programs. They were all within kind of political science departments. So I went the kind of traditional academic route, and I really didn't have any mentors in my academic department that steered me this direction. But as I progressed through graduate school, I realized that I was interested more in doing policy than studying it full-time academically. And I still have my hands in academia. I publish an article every once in a while. I teach every once in a while, but I really wanted to do policy. And conveniently, right when I was working on my dissertation, our first daughter was born. And my wife, who had been working the whole time to put me through graduate school, said that she was ready to quit working for a while and that I needed to start making some money. And so that's what I did. When I was working on my dissertation, I accidentally took a job on the recommendation of an advisor at an organization called the UNC System Office, which is the whole system office for the whole UNC system, all 17 institutions. And conveniently, I wound up working in what was called their research division, which is the division that oversaw all of the research activities across all 17 institutions. And it really opened my eyes to all of the academic research that was going on across all the different disciplines. It exposed me to federal policy, to state policy, to university policy. And once I was exposed to that, I realized that, hey, there was a great world here that I could be a part of and apply all the skills I had learned in grad school, which are really, I think the most important things you learn in grad school is not so much the subject matter expertise, but the methodological skills, how to ask a question, how to research a question, how to write it up, how to explain it to people. So all of those things were being used in my job at the UNC system office. So I worked there for 7 years. Then I did have a mentor who said, okay, it's time for you to leave the nest and it's time to go find another job. And I made kind of a lateral move to the Department of Commerce, the North Carolina Department of Commerce, where I've been for 18 years now, doing very similar work. It's still science policy, but it's science policy with it strongly focused on economic development. And so there are lots of different ways you can evolve into these careers, and you all are going to be well trained, and you just have to find the avenues that feel good to you and that you think you can thrive in.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we all need that boost of confidence in the pandemic right now.
And and there's a lot of uncertainty in the process, like as you alluded to. There's no single path to succeeding. It's not a linear path, most likely. The most important things you can do are to network and to put yourself out there. We've had a lot of, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but we've had a lot of interns in our office, and almost all of them have been graduate students who have reached out to us to say, hey, do you need anybody? And we typically do not have funding to support them just because we've got a limited budget, but we almost always can make available some sort of volunteer opportunity. And that just gets their hands dirty. And that's what you got to do, is you don't know what you like and don't like until you experience it. And once you get in, you will make connections that if you're not doing that, you're not going to make. And so that's key.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to note that this science policy, getting into the field, can be totally accidental. You don't have to be a scientist for it. It's completely, right. You can work in economics and also start dabbling in agriculture. So I really enjoy that part. And you segued really nicely into my next question, which is kind of how can students start to interact with the organizations you all work for? And for you, Dr. Prince, it's kind of what organizations, like you were mentioning, the conference you went to, and now being a AAAS fellow. We'll start with you then. How has AAAS kind of helped propel you into this field of science policy, and kind of what does that day-to-day look like for you?
Great question. Side note, this is my son. He was waving to you all earlier. And so as a AAAS fellow, I'm serving in the United States Department of Defense. And there are actually a lot of different types of fellowships available across different societies. And so what was important for me was to determine which program would suit not just my career interest, but I have priorities as a woman who has a family. And so I kept that in mind when I was making decisions to dive deeper into the science policy realm. And AgriCamps was kind of that first toe into the pool, so to speak. And I would say that because of how forthcoming I am with my career trajectory, it helped a lot, like during my postdoc. And so when I started at NIA, I also completed a detail, which is pretty much a short-term volunteering opportunity at a different institute. And that allowed me to, I guess, experience experience things from the other side of NIH. And so I was involved with writing health policy memos for the director. I was involved in writing, I have a lot of water cans up here. I need to stay hydrated. So I was also responsible for writing health policy data sheets related to minority health. So along those lines. And so I think just keep in mind what your interests are and recognize that there is some sort of policy arm associated with that organization. And also during that postdoc, I volunteered at a nonprofit here in Baltimore that just, again, you just frankly just want to say yes to as many opportunities as you can, just to have an idea of whether or not you're interested in science or policy for science. And then networking is important, but keep in mind that networking in and of itself is building relationships. It shouldn't be a one-sided exchange. And I don't remember what else you asked me, Megan.
Okay, I think you hit everything, and I also asked a bunch of questions in one, so you did great.
Yeah.
I'll pass it over to Brittany. How can students get involved in AGU to engage in science policy and advocacy?
Yeah, so a couple of things come to mind. I think the first being that we have a paid internship. It's a 3-month internship. We generally hire 4 interns a year. We're actually currently wrapping up our intern process right now. So I think that's one opportunity. 2, I think if you join our listserv, we have lots of social media, letter writing campaigns. Like we have a virtual advocacy day focused on climate change coming up in October. And that can be a great way, because I always tell people, I think going to meet with your legislators is like the hardest thing you can do for most people. And so once you get that under your belt, writing your legislators a letter or tweeting at them seems very easy. And then I think for those people looking for, who really want to get engaged, you know, and really want to commit to this and gaining their skills, we have a program called Voices for Science, which both David and Rebecca have been a part of, that kind of forces you to get really engaged at any level of policy, because one of the requirements for the program is that you have to take a monthly science policy action. And we kind of help you figure that out. And a lot of times you work to a bigger goal. But you also help to build community. So I'm like really impressed by your community, because I think that's such an important part of science policy, is that it's a community. And once you have that community, you know, it's not all on you and you can just keep it going. So I think those are kind of some of the best highlights I can think of.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I mean, AGU, I think most of us know, is great, and I love the opportunities that are available. So Erin, I want to hear from you. How can students get involved with nonprofits like the National Audubon Society to advocate on behalf of science and birds in this case?
So many ways. I guess my first suggestion to everyone would be to think about, for advocacy in particular, because it is hard, right? Particularly if you're going to do things like climate that can be divisive and technical and hard to talk about with some folks. And we know there's a lot of tough politics in the issue, is to think about what really moves you. So one of the things we're really lucky to have at Audubon, as I sort of said earlier, is like we have millions of people who just love birds, and they love birds so much that if you can convince them that something will help birds, they will like knock old ladies and children out of the way to get there first, to be the ones to do it. So my job, right, is figuring out with our scientists and with our policy people, like what are the policies that are going to be most efficacious? What are the things that are going to help birds the most? And then my job is to actually go to our members, to go to our grassroots and convince people to give up their very precious free time to do things like Brittany said, like go to that meeting with a legislator, or send a tweet, or send an email, make a phone call, or even better, recruit a friend, right? And recruiting other grassroots folks is really hard. I would put that on par with meeting with legislators. I know Megan has done some recruiting for Audubon, North Carolina, and had some experience with that, but it can be really hard to just go to your friends and say, hey, do you know how important climate change is? Or do you know the impact climate is having on the birds, wildlife, bees, trees, beaches, whatever, moves those people. And so one thing I would pitch to all of you as scientists is that you are uniquely well positioned to deliver those kinds of messages because you actually know the science. I spend a lot of time learning the science. I spend a lot of time helping other, birders learn the science of climate and the science of clean energy solutions and all those things. And admittedly, like very superficial level of understanding. None of us are physicists. None of us know actually how, hydro storage works. But we know enough, and we trust the scientists who have told us that these solutions are the best ones. I believe scientists, even though I am not one, right? And so what y'all have as advocates is actually the ability to do both of those things, because everyone can be an advocate. Everyone's voice is important. You are all in directly impacted communities. When climate change happens, all of us suffer. Some of us more than others or differently than others, but it is, I just think it's always important to come to advocacy, not just as a scientist or a person who has academic expertise, but also as a person who's experiencing the impacts of bad policy or the policy you're trying to change, right? Because you actually can see, touch, and feel the things that are not right, and you can envision a better world. And what advocacy is ultimately about is a shared vision of a better world for you, for your kids, for your grandkids, for birds, for horses or bees or whatever you care about, right? But it's, sometimes it's really easy to get in politics into the like negative cycle. And I, unlike John, I love politics. Like I could do that all day. But you know, ultimately you don't move people with, well, you can, but ideally you don't move people with fear. You move them with hope, you move them with aspiration, and you move them with a call to a big vision. And you guys have the ability to do that as humans and then to back it up with actual science in a way that many of us don't. And that makes you super, super valuable as advocates. And any group that works in science advocacy is like so thrilled to get a real scientist, a real trained scientist in their advocacy roles. Cause then I'm like, yeah, write a letter to the editor. Please go meet with that member, right? Please go talk to your mayor about, you know, a clean energy policy for your city or whatever, because you actually can do it. And you can do it with a depth of knowledge that those of us who are just faking it and playing scientists on TV can't.
Thank you so much. I am like snapping all over the place here. Advocacy is amazing. So go ahead, John. How can you already kind of talked about how students have been directly involved in your office, but maybe at a state level, if you can speak to how students can really start to become more involved at the state level politics.
So, so Dr. Bankston referred to, you know, science for policy and policy for science. And my guess is that most of you are probably at this point interested in science for policy. And the thing you have to understand about the government is where to access. There are better places and not as good of places to access. And you've got the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And for most things, if you're interested in the implementation of policies and programs, the executive branch is really the place to do it. And it's actually often much more accessible because they're the people that are kind of on the ground implementing the policies and also evaluating the policies. And a lot of what I do is like when I go to the doctor, for example, and they say you have to fill out the form and it says, what's your job title? My job title is too long to list and nobody would understand it. So I always write policy analyst because at least maybe people understand what that is. And so a lot of what we do is analyze policy, we develop policy, and we evaluate it. And those use all the skills that I learned in graduate school. And so we also help create policy. And so I think the executive branch, whether it's, you know, in North Carolina, the Department of Environmental Quality, they do a lot of science. The Department of Transportation does. They have a lot of engineers there and scientists. The Department of Commerce does quite a bit, especially in the social sciences. But almost every executive branch agency has some sort of scientific expertise that's needed. The legislative branch is also a way to do it, but it's often harder to I think, break into the legislative branch because even though they're kind of closest to the people, they are pulled a million different directions. And policymakers most of them are generalists and not specialists, especially at the state level. And so at the federal level, they have much more policy staff and you can interact with them more easily. But at the state level, they usually don't have a lot of policy staff to work with. But, you know, I think, and then you've got to, within that, you've got to find the relevant kind of committee, you know, within the legislature. I think Dr. Bankston had a list of all the committees in the Senate or the House. And that's the division of labor for the legislature is out of all the thousands of policy issues they deal with, they all get, you know, dealt with through that committee system. And so you have to find out what's the committee that deals with the issues that you care about. And so finding the committee or finding the legislative branch, the executive branch agency is the first place to start.
Yeah, that's very useful advice. Thank you all so much. We are almost out of time, and I want to ask one more quick rapid pace question. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Prince. What is one piece of advice that you think that graduate students should know or undergrads should know about engaging in science policy and advocacy?
Just one? And quickly? Oh, make sure you know how to write.
That's important. Definitely making sure you know how to write. And definitely what Adriana was saying earlier, writing all those different types of things too. Okay, Erin, I'm going to pop over to you. What is a piece of advice you would want graduate students and undergrads to know about science policy and advocacy?
It's so hard. I think to take time to understand decision makers and power, because if you don't understand where power sits and how decisions really get made, you can spend a lot of time howling at the wind and not getting very far. So power.
That's really cool. I like that idea a lot. It's so important. Brittany, over to you. What's your piece of advice for students?
I'm gonna kind of just say probably ditto to everything everyone else has already said, but I think stay optimistic. I kind of want to echo something Erin said earlier, that I think when you enter into policy, you have to have the mindset that we're all working towards a better future. And despite very hard times, you have to keep that. I think if not, it could be kind of easy to burn out in this profession.
Very true, and so important to take care of yourself, especially right now. John, what is your piece of advice for students?
I would agree with everything that has been said. And what I would add is that it's not always about the data or the information. And I hate saying that because I'm a real data person, and I'm motivated and driven by information. But most people in life and a lot of policymakers are driven by values and emotions. And so that goes to what Erin said. To some extent, you have to understand what people care about. And when you go to speak to a policymaker, do research on them so that you know what their interests are. And you know, they're going to filter your information through their values. So you have to understand what their values are. And it may seem soft, but it is critical to the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're at noon. I don't know if my co-conspirators, David and Becca, want to jump on, but I think everybody could give a reaction emoji of clapping hands to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for all of your wonderful insight on advocacy and science policy. This has been such a nice morning refresher. And to the students who are asking about further opportunities for how to get involved, or how to learn more about writing and policy, stay tuned. Sign up for our training series. That's what we're here for. And our groups here in North Carolina are actively planning these events or workshops on how to write policy memos and how to form your ask to a policymaker. So we are here for you, and we're open to feedback onto what you might want to hear from us. So if David and Becca don't have anything else, thank you to Adriana for our keynote, and we will sign off. Thank you again.